Violin strings snap under too much pressure. Adeline Marsh learned that at age 12, and she was relearning it at 27, standing in a borrowed catering uniform 3 feet from the most dangerous man in Boston. But 20 minutes ago, her only problem had been keeping a tray of crab-stuffed mushrooms level while navigating a sea of tuxedos. The Harborview Grand Ballroom had been dressed for the occasion like a woman trying to hide a bruise beneath pearls, every surface polished, every candle lit, every smile calibrated to project legitimacy. The New England Justice Foundation's annual gala drew exactly the kind of crowd you'd expect. Judges who golfed with defense attorneys, city councilmen who shook hands with men who shouldn't be photographed in public, and at the center of it all, like a spider who had built his web so elegantly you mistook it for decoration, sat Riordan Cross. Adeline had known the name before tonight. Everyone in South Boston knew the name. Cross Meridian, the holding company, the real estate portfolio, the venture capital arm that somehow always turned a profit regardless of market conditions. It was the kind of empire that existed in plain sight because its owner understood that invisibility was for people who couldn't afford lawyers. Riordan Cross didn't hide. He simply made himself untouchable. He sat alone in a curved corner booth draped in deep navy velvet, separated from the rest of the gala by the invisible architecture of fear. 2 men flanked him, massive, still, professionally blank-faced. But the one who caught Adeline's attention was the man seated across from Cross, leaning forward, speaking in a low voice with the ease of someone who believed himself indispensable. Hadley Pierce, Cross's second-in-command. The name she'd heard 3 days ago when Danny called from a number she didn't recognize. Voice cracked, telling her he was in trouble. Danny had borrowed $45,000 from a private lender called North Shore Capital. No website, no registered address, just a name on a wire transfer. Adeline had traced it in 4 hours. North Shore Capital was a shell, nested inside 2 others, ultimately traceable to Cross Meridian if you knew what columns to look at and how offshore routing codes disguised themselves as legitimate transfers. She'd spent 3 years studying forensic accounting before her mother got sick, and the tuition stopped being manageable, and the nursing program offered a scholarship. She knew how money hid. Danny hadn't known any of that. He'd needed cash fast. A man at his job site had a number, and $45,000 had seemed manageable until it wasn't. The deadline had passed. Pierce's people had visited Danny's apartment and left behind a dislocated shoulder, a very clear message, and a promise to return with something permanent. Adeline had tried everything in 72 hours. Banks said no. Her savings were $4,000. Pawning her violin, the one her mother had saved for 3 years to buy her, would yield maybe $800. The math didn't work. But Riordan Cross was on the guest list for this gala, and Adeline was already scheduled to work the catering shift. And somewhere between her 2nd cup of cold coffee and her 4th dead end, a plan had formed that she had enough sense to recognize as possibly fatal and not quite enough sense to abandon. She set her tray down on a side table near the dessert display. Her hands were steadier than they had any right to be. The catering supervisor had been explicit. Nobody approached the corner booth. The instruction had been delivered with the kind of weight that suggested consequences more severe than losing a gig. But Adeline looked at Danny's face in her memory, the photo he'd sent, his shoulder swollen to twice its size, and she walked. The 2 guards clocked her immediately. The one on the left shifted his weight. The one on the right placed his hand slowly, deliberately, inside his jacket. Hadley Pierce stopped mid-sentence, his pale eyes narrowing at her with the expression of a man calculating exactly how much of an inconvenience she represented. The entire section of the ballroom near the booth went quiet. Conversations dropped. Someone stopped laughing mid-law. Even the string quartet in the corner seemed to sense the change in barometric pressure and softened into something almost funereal. Riordan Cross looked up. He was younger looking than she'd expected, though something in his eyes was ancient and exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Dark hair, cut short. a jaw that looked like it had been designed by someone with opinions. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, the top button of his shirt open, the single detail that distinguished him from every other powerful man in the room, all of whom seemed to be strangling themselves in Windsor knots. He held a glass of scotch, and he set it down slowly, studying her the way a surgeon studies an X-ray, looking for the fracture. "Miss," Hadley Pierce said, his voice a flat wall, "you need to return to the service area." Adeline stopped. Her knees wanted to buckle. She introduced herself instead. "Mr. Cross." Her voice came out cleaner than she felt. "My name is Adeline Marsh. I believe you know my brother Danny. I'd like 3 minutes of your time." Pierce made a sound like she'd said something obscene. One of the guards took a step forward. But Cross raised one finger. The room seemed to exhale. Pierce settled back. The guard stopped. And Riordan Cross looked at Adeline Marsh, her borrowed uniform, her serviceable flats, the slight tremor she was managing to suppress with the same muscle memory she used to hold a bow through a recital when she was terrified, and said, in a voice that was surprisingly quiet for a man everyone in Boston was afraid of, "What do you play?" She blinked. "I'm sorry." "Your left hand." He nodded at it. "The calluses, you play strings." "Violin." She straightened. "But that's not what I'm here about." "I know what you're here about." He leaned back, watching her. "Tell me why I shouldn't have Mr. Pierce escort you out right now." "Because I can read your books," she said. "Not your public filings, your real ones." The silence that followed was different from the one before. This one had weight. Cross tilted his head slightly. "Sit down, Miss Marsh." Pierce shot his boss a look that Adeline caught and filed away without showing she'd noticed. There was something in it. A fraction of a second too long, a shade too controlled that didn't read like concern, it read like calculation. She sat. "Danny borrowed money he couldn't repay," she said, keeping her voice even. "I don't have 45,000. But I spent 3 years in forensic accounting before nursing school. I can do in 4 hours what your accountants do in 4 days. I can find holes in tax structures, identify suspicious routing patterns, clean a ledger without leaving fingerprints. Give me a job. Let me work off what Danny owes. I am not asking you to forgive the debt. I am asking you to let me earn it." Cross studied her for a long moment. His expression hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted. The way water looks different the moment before it starts to move. "You walked into this room," he said slowly, "knowing exactly who I am, to offer to commit federal crimes on my behalf, for a brother who sounds like he made a very expensive mistake." "He's my family," Adeline said. "He's all I have left." Something crossed Riordan Cross's face that she couldn't name. It was there and gone in the span of a breath. He opened his mouth to respond. That was when Adeline's peripheral vision caught something wrong. Near the service entrance on the far side of the ballroom, a man in a hotel security uniform was moving along the wall. She'd been working catering gigs long enough to know hotel security. She'd seen 12 of them tonight. They all wore the same soft-soled shoes, moved with the specific combination of boredom and vigilance that came from 8-hour shifts on marble floors. This man was wearing tactical boots. He was also reaching into what looked like a photography equipment case propped against the wall. He wasn't reaching for a camera. Adeline didn't think. She had half a second and she used it. Down, she threw herself across the table, hitting Cross in the chest with her full weight, somehow finding enough force to knock a 6-foot man sideways off his seat just as the far wall of the booth exploded in a crack of suppressed gunfire. The champagne tower behind the booth detonated into a fountain of glass and foam. The decorative mirror above it shattered, raining silver fragments across the floor. For a fraction of a second, the ballroom didn't understand what had happened. Then it understood all at once. The screaming started, the stampede, the string quartet dropping their instruments mid-phrase. Politicians who made speeches about law and order diving beneath cocktail tables. Cross hit the floor with Adeline sprawling beside him. In the same motion, he grabbed her arm and rolled them both behind the overturned booth table as gunfire opened up in earnest. Not suppressed anymore, just raw and deafening, ricocheting off marble and punching through the panicked noise of 500 terrified people. "You saved my life," Cross said, not as a compliment but as a statement of fact, like confirming the temperature of something. His eyes swept the room with a clarity that seemed almost inhuman given the circumstances. He pulled a pistol from a shoulder holster Adeline hadn't known was there. "Can you move?" "Yes." "Kitchen surface exit, go." She went. They sprinted through the chaos with Cross half a step behind her, using overturned tables and fleeing guests as cover. Adeline knew this kitchen. She'd worked the prep area since 7 o'clock. She knew where the floor got slippery near the dishwashing station, and where the freight elevator sat behind a door marked staff only that most people ignored. They crashed through it, and she hit the elevator button before she'd consciously decided to, her hand landing on the cold metal with the certainty of muscle memory. The doors opened. They fell inside. Cross fired twice back down the corridor, and then the heavy doors closed and the sound cut off like a switch being thrown. The elevator descended in silence. Adeline slid down the metal wall until she hit the floor. Her lungs weren't working properly. She looked at her hands, shaking now, the adrenaline finding the cracks she'd held shut for the last 4 minutes. Cross stood over her, checking his weapon's magazine with practiced hands. His jacket was torn at the shoulder. A thin cut above his eyebrow was bleeding without seeming to concern him in the slightest. "You know this building well," he said. "I've worked here every other Saturday for 4 months." She heard how her voice sounded, threadbare, stripped down to something honest. The freight elevator was in the catering orientation packet. He almost smiled. She couldn't be entirely sure. The elevator opened to a loading dock. A black armored SUV was running near the exit ramp, but the driver was slumped over the wheel. Cross assessed the situation in 1 second and made his decision in the next. Pulling the driver clear, sliding behind the wheel himself, tossing Adeline a look that didn't leave room for discussion. They were on the street in 40 seconds. Cross, driving with the controlled aggression of someone who had done this many times before, the city lights smearing past the bulletproof windows in streaks of amber and white. "The man with the tactical boots," Adeline said when she could form words again. "He came through the service entrance. That gala had biometric security at the employee check-in. I watched them scan every badge at 6 o'clock. Nobody gets through with a weapons case unless someone inside the building let them in." Cross's hands tightened on the wheel. "The Kellerman family has been positioning against me for months. This is their style." "It's not, though." Adeline stared through the windshield, turning the thought over the way she used to turn a balance sheet. Patient, methodical, looking for the number that didn't belong. "The Kellermans work through intermediaries." This was internal clearance. That man moved through the building like he'd had a walkthrough. He knew exactly where your booth was. He wasn't set up for a wide sweep. He was aimed specifically at your corner of the room. She paused. "You don't have a Kellerman problem, Mr. Cross. You have someone in your own organization who mapped the room for them." The silence in the car stretched for a full city block. Then quietly, "If you're wrong, Miss Marsh." "I'm not wrong." She didn't know exactly where the certainty came from. She only knew she'd spent 3 years learning to read the shape of hidden things. And whatever was wrong tonight had the same silhouette as financial fraud. Deliberate, patient, completely invisible, until you looked at the right column. The safe house was a penthouse above a glass tower on Commonwealth Avenue. Registered to a company name Adeline didn't recognize. Furnished with the stripped-down precision of a man who used space without inhabiting it. Cross pulled up security feeds on a bank of monitors. Adeline accepted the glass of water he set in front of her without comment and wrapped both hands around it to stop the shaking. Hadley Pierce arrived 20 minutes later. He came through the private elevator looking appropriately shaken, jacket askew, color high, and launched immediately into his report. The Kellermans had hit 3 distribution points during the gala attack. Coordinated, sophisticated. He needed Cross to authorize a full response before dawn. While Pierce talked, Adeline wasn't listening to the words. She was watching his hands. Pierce was a precise man. She'd noticed that in the ballroom, every gesture controlled, every movement economical. But right now his right hand kept returning to the cuff of his jacket, adjusting and readjusting something that didn't need adjusting. It was the tell of a man holding a story together through sheer force of will. She also noticed that one of the financial windows Cross had minimized on the monitors was a routing summary. She could see the column headers from where she sat. North Shore Capital appeared twice in the visible rows, with transfer timestamps from the last 48 hours. Not from Danny's original loan, but new activity. Fresh transactions, 2 days old. She stood up. "He's lying," she said. Pierce turned toward her with the expression of a man who has just realized the room contained something he badly underestimated. "I don't think I'm a nurse," Adeline said, "and before that I was a forensic accounting student. And in the last 3 minutes I've been reading the routing summary on that screen." She walked to the monitors, pulling up the window fully, her hands steadier now that she had numbers in front of her instead of bullets. North Shore Capital was created 18 months ago. It's registered to a trust in the Cayman Islands. The trust has one beneficial owner. She watched Pierce's face go the color of old paper. The owner's digital signature on the trust documents matches the filing pattern of a subsidiary called Meridian Bridge Holdings. She turned to face him directly. "Meridian Bridge is registered to your brother-in-law, Mr. Pierce, which means you have been running a shadow lending operation using Cross Meridian's client network for a year and a half, skimming collection fees, and tonight you finally decided that having Mr. Cross removed was cheaper than having him find out." The room held its breath. Pierce reached for his weapon. Cross was faster. It was over in a sound that Adeline knew she would not be able to get out of her memory, sharp, final, definitively quiet. Pierce folded to the floor. Adeline stood very still. The water glass was still in her hand. She set it carefully on the desk before she dropped it. Cross holstered his weapon with the same steady hands he'd had all evening. He looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he was reading in her face, he seemed to be reading it carefully. "Your brother's debt is cleared," he said, "tonight." "Thank you." The words came out smaller than she intended. "Danny will receive a call in the morning. He is not to gamble. With anything. Ever again." The instruction landed with the weight of something that was not a request. "He won't." She knew that the way she knew most things about Danny, completely, helplessly, with the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent their whole life loving someone reckless. Cross crossed the room until he was standing close enough that she could see the cut above his eye still hadn't stopped bleeding, and for some reason that was the detail that nearly undid her. He was a man who had been shot at tonight and was standing here bleeding from a cut above his eye without appearing to notice it, and she was the one holding herself together with both hands. "I need an accountant who cannot be bought," he said quietly. "I need someone who reads patterns that other people can't see, and I need someone who does not panic when the room catches fire." She looked at him. "I panicked a little. You pushed me off a chair 3 seconds before a bullet would have ended my life," Cross said. "I'll take that over someone who doesn't panic." She had every reason to say no. She understood that with the same mathematical clarity with which she had understood that Danny's debt was unpayable. The numbers simply didn't work. Stepping into this world was not a thing a person stepped back out of. She knew that. She had always known that, since the moment she sat down across from him in a borrowed uniform and offered to read his books. She was already inside it. The door had closed behind her the moment she walked toward his booth. Cross extended his hand. It was the same gesture she had made to him in the ballroom 3 hours ago, in a room that no longer existed in the same shape. An offer, an edge, an open question waiting for an answer. Adeline Marsh had been a violin teacher and a catering employee, and a nursing student, and a forensic accounting dropout, and her brother's keeper, all at once, for years, and she had never once been given a seat at any table that mattered. She placed her hand in his. The city hummed 40 stories below them, indifferent and enormous, and somewhere in it Danny was safe and asleep, and somewhere the night had not yet finished deciding what to make of her. But she had already decided.